Uh-huh. Okay. All right, I'll get to work on it. I'll give you a call back. All right, bye. In October of 1988, the ex-chief of staff for the Ronald Reagan administration, Don Regan, published his memoir, For the Record, detailing his political career and the chaos during which he ended up leaving the Reagan administration. With all the grace and restraint he could muster, he waited until the very first page of the book to deliver the shocking news that the president's schedule was handled almost entirely by the First Lady on the advice of an astrologer from San Francisco. Regan felt this information was necessary to explain the unorthodox approach the White House took in response to the Iran-Contra scandal, for which Regan himself was assigned a lot of the blame. After the news broke of secret weapon sales to Iran, the president avoided all press conferences for months, leaving Americans and the media in the dark about his side of the story. It turns out that this direction was taken on recommendation from that astrologer and not from someone within the White House, and certainly not from Regan himself, who had always advocated the president face the nation immediately after the story broke. This astrologer was Joan Quigley, a California native born into a wealthy family who became interested in astrology in college after having studied art history. Her mother had an interest in astrology, and using her connections, Joan landed an astrology column in 17 magazine, where she wrote under the name Angel Star because her father disapproved of astrology and her interest in it. She would write one book titled Astrology for Teens under this name before eventually writing Astrology for Adults and Astrology for Parents of Children and Teenagers under her real name. There's actually a really sweet story where, after publishing Astrology for Adults under her real name, her father gifted to her a necklace as a show of support for her work, and we just love that. Good job, Dad. Quigley would meet Nancy Reagan in 1973, but this wasn't the first time that either Nancy or Ronald Reagan had worked with an astrologer. They had been doing it for years. Famously, both Ronald and Nancy were actors before they met, married, and shifted their focus into public service. Their work environment and entertainment would naturally put them in the same sphere as astrologers and other kinds of celebrity advisors. On the non-astrological side, Luella Parsons was a famous gossip columnist who took an interest in Ronald's career early, gave him advice, and helped him to get better roles. This is basically the beginning of an established pattern of women advising Ronald in his career goals. The first astrologer that we know both Nancy and Ronald consulted with was Carol Ryder. Ryder was a famous lifelong bachelor, read gay, and well-to-do astrologer who had rich and powerful people among his clientele, and was syndicated in over 160 newspapers. We know that Ryder was involved to some extent with Ronald's pursuit of the governorship of California, but it seems like most of the work would fall to Jean Dixon, a student of Ryder, who was said to have predicted Reagan's attainment of the office. Interestingly enough, Richard Nixon followed the predictions of Jean Dixon through his personal secretary, Rosemary Woods, and even hosted Dixon at the White House at least once. It is unclear, though, to what extent Nixon really listened to Jean's advice, because honestly, her predictions are all over the place. Regardless, we see that there may be a theme here regarding controversial Republican presidents and the seers who assist them. Can I just stop for a second to point out how annoying telling this story is? Not only is there the Reagans and their chief of staff Don Regan, but now there's President Nixon and Seer Dixon. Thank God Quigley's name is unique enough, or we would all be super confused in this. Back to the Reagans, though we don't know exactly how involved Ryder was with, helping with the campaign for governor, things like that, we do know that he did elect the time of Ronald Reagan's inauguration as governor of California for the very unorthodox time of just after midnight. The official reason was to keep the previous governor from kind of sneaking through any last-minute judicial appointments, but, we'll talk more about that in a later section. We don't know exactly when the Reagans stopped consulting Ryder, or when they switched to Dixon, or when they switched to Quigley, nor do we really know what kind of advice Reagan was receiving from any source while he was governor. What we do know is that Quigley was introduced to Nancy Reagan via Merv Griffin, whose show she would often appear on. Quigley doesn't talk really about how she came to know Merv Griffin, only that she was invited to appear and used her first appearance to apparently predict Griffin's divorce live on air in front of his audience of millions in what we would today call a total dick move. Joan says Nancy would consult with her about once a year in kind of a standard year ahead type style of consultation that probably wasn't very different from what an astrologer would do today for a client. These conversations would, of course, migrate over to Ronald's chart, as it's helpful to get an idea of what's going on with one spouse in order to really predict very well for the other. I get it. And Quigley found herself doing both charts at least once a year. By the time Ronald Reagan was preparing for his first attempt at the presidency in 1976, Quigley had been working with the charts of the Reagans for about 3 years. Quigley talks about helping out with the campaign, but says that she did so little that she couldn't really even remember what it was that she did. Quigley says she foresaw defeat and didn't want to commit so much of her time to something that wasn't going to work out, mood. She was, of course, correct, and Reagan did lose the Republican primary to the incumbent President Gerald Ford. This was not like a very shocking prediction or outcome, of course, as no incumbent president in modern history has lost their party's nomination between terms. Quigley was much more involved in the 1980s campaign, which she became a part of after sending a letter to Nancy detailing Ronald's horoscope and transits between August and the election. This included a warning about making foreign policy statements on August 19th, which was the day that candidate Reagan said he would recognize Taiwan's independence, which was considered something of a gaffe as it immediately jeopardizes any administration's relationship with China. That's really still a problem that politicians face today, so whoops. Quigley also chose the time for the presidential debate between Carter and Reagan on October 28th, taking credit for Carter's gaffe regarding his daughter and their discussion of nuclear weaponry, which didn't really sound like a big deal, but apparently it was. The rest, as you know, is history, and on November 4th, 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected the 40th President of the United States. Even though the Reagans went to the White House, they did not immediately take the services of Joan Quigley with them. In On the Record, Don Regan talks about in his meetings with Mike Deaver and Bill Heinkel, the Deputy Chief of Staff and Deputy Assistant to the President, about scheduling. They told Regan that Nancy had always advocated using astrology for scheduling, even back when Ronald was the governor of California, but that they had mostly had to deal with Jean Dixon, not Joan Quigley. They were also very excited to be rid of Jean Dixon when she was gone. It was Dixon who was the main source of astrological advice or occult wisdom for the Reagan White House until March 30th, 1981, when President Ronald Reagan was shot by John Hinckley Jr. outside of the Washington Hilton. Presumably, Dixon was unable to foresee the attempt on the president's life, which caused a falling out with Nancy, obviously. So, needing a new astrologer, Nancy turned to her old friend, Joan. There is a myth out there that the Reagans used astrology to break Tecumseh's curse, but that's actually not true, as we can see now that astrology became more of a central tool of the Reagans only after this attempt on Ronald's life. For those who don't know, the United States is cursed. If the wealth inequality, systemic racism, child hunger, high infant mortality rate, voter suppression, and general attack on the rights of minorities wasn't included enough, that something wasn't quite right, then have I got a story for you. Throughout the early 1800s, the United States was looking to expand into native lands, and did so through a series of conflicts and treaties, many of which were unfair, or the U.S. just left mostly unfulfilled. Hello, Bubbles. In 1809, then Governor of Illinois Territory William Henry Harrison began pushing for access to more native land for white settlers, and sought treaties to purchase or give native tribes out of their land. Yeah. I don't know how Joan Quigley would have felt about cats, but I feel like she would have loved them. Also, Bubbles just wants my rubber band very badly, and that's why she's here, to kind of cute me out of my rubber band. But it's a part of my set, Bubbles. I need it to set the ambiance of the mood. You want me to make a call? Who do you want to call? In 1809, then Governor of the Illinois Territory, William Henry Harrison, began pushing for access to more native land for white settlers and sought treaties or purchases to grift native tribes out of their land. One of these treaties was the Treaty of Fort Wayne. This treaty was signed by the U.S. government and several native leaders, but some, like Tecumseh of the Shawnee tribe, questioned its legitimacy and how some native leaders could rightfully sell land that many different tribes had rights to or had shared. This treaty was used as something of a rallying cry for Tecumseh's goal of native unity against U.S. incursion onto native land. Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa set up something of a native confederacy called Prophetstown near the Tippecanoe River, and this village was eventually attacked by Harrison and ultimately defeated. Tecumseh was not present during the attack, but would eventually come to rally even more native peoples to join the British in the War of 1812. The story here is a little unclear, but at some point during the conflict, either after the razing of Prophetstown or maybe even after Tecumseh's death during the War of 1812, Tenskwatawa supposedly put a curse on the United States, specifically on the office of the presidency. In a prime example of poetic justice, the first victim of the curse would be William Henry Harrison himself, who famously died just 31 days after taking his oath of office. Since then, every president who was elected in a year ending in a 0 has died in office, either through illness or through assassination, and you can see the list of those presidents, their year elected, and the cause of death on the screen. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, would be the next in line following the very dramatic and very public assassination of the last victim of the curse, John F. Kennedy. For whatever reason, be it luck, fate, destiny, or the cruel workings of an unjust god, Reagan survived his assassination attempt and seemingly broke the curse, but astrology did not play a factor in this. Since Reagan, Republican President George W. Bush, who was elected in 2000, also survived to the end of his second term despite an assassination attempt in 2005 that I didn't hear about until researching this video, and anyone I've asked about if they knew George W. Bush had survived an assassination attempt had the same response. Oh, you mean that shoe thing? No, he dodged a fucking grenade. Currently, Joe Biden, elected in 2020, would appear to be the next target of the curse and has brought some renewed interest in it due to his advanced age, so I guess we'll see how that goes. Back to our main story. In her book, Quigley talks about meeting with Nancy soon after the shooting, after not having heard from her since January of 1981, so since she moved to the White House. She says, "This is what Nancy said that day. I remember it verbatim. First, she asked, 'Could you have told about the assassination attempt?' Yes, of course," I replied. "I could had I been looking. However, I haven't been following your charts or tracking the mundane material for Washington. I'm sorry, had I been looking, I would have warned you." This is a textbook example of emotionally manipulating a grieving and scared relative of a victim. For all you consulting astrologers out there, this is how not to handle that kind of a situation. It's unprofessional and kind of predatory. Regardless, Nancy hired Quigley on full-time. She paid Quigley her hourly rate, which we are not told what that was. But during the last year that she was working with the White House, she charged a fixed fee of $3,000 a month, which would be about $7,200 in 2022. Like, that's good money. By May of 1981, Joan Quigley is the astrologer to the President of the United States. Here she has some control over timing his schedule and using astrology to assist in advancing his policy. Let's take a second to look at how the Astrologers writer and Quigley used astrology to help the Reagans. We're going to begin our story at the beginning, like the very beginning, with Ronald Reagan's birth chart. One thing that becomes clear as we move through the story and follow the astrology is that the commonly accepted chart that is displayed on like Ronald Reagan's Astro Databank page is wrong, or at least it's not the same chart that the astrologers that have actively worked with Reagan's chart were using at the time. If you go down to the source notes on the page for Astro Databank, they explain why they have stuck with the time that they have displayed. In her book, What Does Joan Say?, Joan Quigley spends an entire chapter discussing the birth chart of Ronald Reagan, and while she does not go super into specifics, since she doesn't provide exact degrees placements or any planets or points that would help us to do anything with it, she does confirm the Sagittarius rising, but also admits that she has rectified the chart herself. I have my own opinions about rectification, but that's not super important. What is important is that the time she seems to have arrived on was 3:43 a.m. This chart lines up much better with some of the important times that were selected for him to work with. For example, if we take a look at the chart for his inauguration into the governorship of California, we know that Carol Ryder chose that moment for a specific reason. Supposedly, the reason was because Jupiter was culminating, which is, I guess, kind of true, as Jupiter's in the 10th house, but it's still pretty far off from the midheaven, and I would have a difficult time saying that it's culminating. What catches my eye in this is the 10 degrees Libra ascendant and Mars at 14 degrees Libra. An odd choice until you see Ronald Reagan's chart for the 3:43 time, where 12 Libras on the midheaven. In the election chart, the astrologer brought the client's natal midheaven to the ascendant of the event, which is a classic electional technique. Use it all the time. You should too. We see this play out again in another important chart, jumping forward a bit in time, for Reagan's announcement for his seeking a second presidential term in January of 1984. This was selected by Quigley. In this chart, 16 degrees of Libra is on the ascendant, bringing us back to the president's natal midheaven degree in the 3:43 a.m. chart. We can see another instance of this in July of 1985. Quigley elected the timing of Ronald Reagan's colon cancer surgery for the 13th at 12 noon. Again, we see the mid-degrees of Libra on the ascendant. A slight subversion of this rule occurred in 1983 when President Reagan visited the demilitarized zone in South Korea, where we can find 15 degrees Libra on the midheaven of the chart. So we're still hammering in on these degrees of Libra from 10 to 15 degrees, but now we've just put on the midheaven in this case. This appears to be one of Quigley's favorite methods of timing. It's honestly really powerful and effective technique, so I'm not complaining. Like I said, you should use it too. But I would like to finalize my case with another example of a Quigley elected chart. This time not for the president, but for a Supreme Court Justice nominee. In the autumn of 1987, Ronald Reagan set about looking to fill the Supreme Court seat left vacant by Lewis F. Powell Jr.'s retirement. His first pick, Robert Bork, was rejected by the Senate 58-42, with 6 Republicans joining the Democrats to send Bork packing, partly because of Bork's more extreme right-wing views on several several topics, but also because Bork followed through on orders from then-President Richard Nixon to fire the special prosecutor involved in investigating the Watergate scandal, even when his two bosses refused and resigned. Apparently, Bork was promised a Supreme Court seat by Nixon for his loyalty, because what the fuck is going on? I guess to be fair, it's just very nice to see that times really haven't changed. Jumping back to our present story, Reagan's second pick for the seat was Douglas Ginsburg, would withdraw from consideration after news of his marijuana use in college came to light, which is honestly just really hilarious to think about considering what we've been through lately. It wasn't until the third Reagan nomination in Anthony Kennedy that Nancy got Joan involved, or at least that's how the story goes. Joan then picked the timing for Reagan to announce Kennedy's nomination, which was given on November 11th, 1987 at 11:32. This resulted in the chart you see here with 20 degrees Capricorn on the ascendant. Guess what Anthony Kennedy's midheaven degree is? It's 20 degrees Capricorn. I'm convinced beyond doubt that Quigley would use a similar method for electing things for the president himself, making those early middle degrees of Libra pretty suspicious in my book. The descriptions of Quigley's duties and work as the White House astrologer has changed over the years. In his book On the Record, Don Regan talks about how involved Quigley was, saying that days and times were color-coded on his calendar, green for good, yellow for okay, red for bad, based on Quigley's recommendations, and that times for speeches, appearances, and even Air Force One takes-offs and landings were okayed through her, and that she even timed significant meetings with other world leaders like the Geneva Summit. At first, even Quigley denied being so involved, specifically denying her involvement in the Geneva Summit in an interview with People magazine in 1988, saying that the summits were arranged by the State Department and Reagan and Schultz. I had absolutely nothing to do with it. I think people are overemphasizing my role. Her tone would change following the publication of Nancy Reagan's biographical memoir, My Turn, in 1989. In this book, Nancy dedicates a chapter to the astrology fiasco, claiming to have only turned to astrology as a crutch following the assassination attempt in 1981. Her story was that she was on the phone with Merv Griffin, who mentioned having recently had a conversation with Joan Quigley about the assassination attempt, saying that the president should have stayed home, and that Quigley could see from her charts that it was a dangerous time. This makes it seem like Quigley was kind of, putting her feelers out there in hopes that it would reach Nancy and reel her in, rather than Nancy kind of seeking Quigley out on her own. We know that Joan and Nancy did not part ways amicably. After Regan's book came out exposing Joan's involvement with astrology and Nancy told Joan that she could never tell anyone about it, and to just lie about it all if she had to. It's likely that some of Joan's early interviews following the ordeal tried to downplay things in order to save the Reagans some face politically. Presumably, Quigley felt a little thrown under the bus about the whole ordeal, and changes her story, explaining in her book What Does Joan Say that I was responsible for timing all press conferences, most speeches, the State of the Union addresses, the takeoffs and landings of Air Force One. I picked the time of Ronald Reagan's debate with Carter and the 2 debates with Walter Mondale, all extended trips abroad, as well as the shorter trips and one-day excursions, the announcement that Reagan would run for a second term, briefings for all the summits except Moscow. Although I selected the time to begin the Moscow trip, I timed congressional arm twisting, the second inaugurational oath of office, the announcement of Anthony Kennedy's Supreme Court nomination. I delayed President Reagan's first operation for cancer from July 10th, 1985 to July 13th and chose the time for Nancy's mastectomy. I recreated Nancy's image, diffused Blitberg, erected a chart for the INF treaty. During Irongate, I sided with Nancy against Don Regan's proposal to have the president go on the road to defend his policies 1 week after his second operation for cancer. I exposed the president as little as possible to the public and the media from January to August 1987. I protected him from both the physical and political dangers I foresaw. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but as far as anyone was concerned, astrology was being used by the Reagan administration secretly and seemingly to decent success for about 7 years before Don Regan talked about it in his book. The revelation set off a firestorm in the media, with many journalists looking to find the astrologer mentioned in Don Regan's book, and many more astrologers pretending to have been that astrologer. The astrological community was elated and felt vindicated by the use of astrology by the highest office in the country. And to this day, Joan Quigley is looked at as something of an aspiration for what astrologers and astrology could be. Kate Plum, writing for the Mountain Astrologer in 2014 after Quigley's death, laments, "Where are these politicians and political operatives today when we need them?" after discussing how the Reagans changed scheduling plans in response to Quigley's advice. But is that really such a good thing? Was the Reagans' use of astrology something we should think about as a golden age of astrology in modern times? I'm not so sure. It's very common on social media to see posts or comments about how people don't want to see politics involved in their astrology. They just want the astrology, and they don't really care about hearing any sort of political leaning or angle in that astrology. This is a tall order and goes against the origins of astrology, as in some of its earliest practices, astrology was used politically by kings and royalty in ways very similar to how Quigley had used astrology for the Reagans. The fact of the matter is that for at least 7 years, astrology was used as a political weapon by a sitting Republican president and used as a method to pass or defend his agenda. The Reagan administration was not inconsequential. Every Republican president since has tried to capitalize on or call back to the Reagan era as something of like a golden era of conservative politics, the Reagan Republican, as it were, which is a phrase so amorphous that almost any Republican politician can seize it to their cause, but also so visceral that others just kind of like respond to it and line up behind it. The Reagan administration enacted policies or legitimized views that had become basically the bread and butter of American right-wing political platforms that many people are still negatively affected by today. Law and order, or the war on crime, were concepts developed by right-wing politicians as racist dog whistles to scare and galvanize white voters. This was used to great effect by Ronald Reagan, and we still see politicians using it today in response to the Black Lives Matter movement or any sort of left-leaning demonstrations. It's also very closely associated with the war on drugs, which, while started under Richard Nixon, was greatly expanded under Reagan, and this continues to stigmatize and blame those suffering with drug addiction. These policies choose to incarcerate or fine people using illegal substances instead of funding programs that might help them to escape the cycle of addiction. It famously focuses on drugs that are more commonly found among poor communities or targets people of color, while ignoring those drugs that are more popular among the wealthy. We also continue to live with trickle-down economic policies that are often referred to as Reaganomics, which include the trickle-down model as part of that system. This is a policy that has continued to allow the wealthy and large corporations to pay much less in taxes than they ought, often paying nothing or being subsidized themselves. Reagan slashed the top marginal tax rate from 70% in 1980 to 50% in 1981, all the way down to 28% by the time he left office in 1988. This tax rate has never recovered from this aggressive cut, today only being 37%. The myth of the welfare bum continues today. That was something that Ronald Reagan used to great effect during his campaigns. After the news about Linda Taylor, a woman who committed welfare fraud on a pretty large scale, came to light. This conservative fear-mongering about how minorities are stealing government money and not working, even though the majority of people on welfare are white, is partly the reason why the United States still does not really have a robust social safety net. This has become especially meaningful today as the expanded unemployment benefits that began in response to the COVID-19 pandemic have all expired, and politicians, especially on the right, are not willing to expand them, fearing that it is creating a worker shortage, when, come to find out, the worker shortage is being created primarily by people over 55 who have decided to retire early. President Biden's child tax credit is also under fire from the right for not including a work requirement because the United States is so against lazy people, us, getting money in any amount for seemingly nothing. Speaking of contemporary effects of the Reagan presidency, it is interesting to see how much of the things that were happening in the Reagan administration came back in some form during the Trump presidency. Make America Great Again was a phrase first used by Ronald Reagan in a speech he gave in New York. The complete botching of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was eerily similar to the terrible response to the AIDS epidemic during the Reagan administration. The Space Force that Trump revitalized is basically a reimagining of the Space Defense Initiative that Reagan gleefully backed, even things like Supreme Court Justice Anthony Kennedy, remember him, unexpectedly retiring and paving the way for Trump to nominate Brett Kavanaugh to the court. I fully expect that even in response to this video, people will criticize me for bringing politics into astrology. But I point all of this out to show that I'm not throwing the first punch here. Joan Quigley didn't either, as rulers throughout history have used astrology for political purposes. I'm just asking us to take a second to consider what the effects of that look like today. Astrologers are very quick to idolize Joan Quigley and the work that she did for the Reagan administration. They see it as a legitimization of their craft, which really comes as no surprise considering how much of a beating astrology takes in the media and online. I guess we'll take whatever wins we can get, I get it. They also see Quigley's work as evidence of how effective astrology can be when used to this extent by people with power to affect real change. I would counter that we spent so much time feeling haughty about it and yearning to be able to kind of do that more that we never stopped to consider whether or not that was actually a good thing to do. If you believe that astrology is a useful tool and timing can be utilized to great advantage to increase the likelihood of securing certain outcomes, which is pretty standard astrological thought, then we as astrologers have to come to face the fact that astrology is partly to blame for the difficult experience that many people have in the United States under the laws and systems set up by the Ronald Reagan presidency. We must also understand that due to the astrological timing, these policies may be more ingrained and difficult to move past than had they not been brought under advantageous skies. By plugging a harmful policy into the very inception of the nation itself, the nation morphs to more easily accept or embody these policies at an almost collective unconscious level, making reform and repeal more difficult. This is not a success story. This is a cautionary tale. I didn't make this video to try and throw Joan Quigley under the bus. Nancy can handle that for me. Nor was I trying to mock or belittle her and the work that she did. I wanted to bring to light the consequences of a weaponized political astrology. I completely understand and support her efforts to use astrology for the health and safety of the president and the first lady. I get it. I'm down for it. Where Joan Quigley messed up, I think, was using astrology as a hammer to nail in the president's agenda, instead of using astrology to ensure the effects of this agenda would be helpful to the people who would have to live with it. Astrology was a tool to drive forward Reagan's political career instead of a check to ensure it supported and bettered her country and fellow citizens. Quigley talks several times in her book about how she considered things like, will the president be safe? And will this thing be well received by the public and the media? Never does she wonder, will the outcome of this thing be good for the country? This is very disappointing and has left us with the political reality that we now exist in. But it seems very in character for someone who was born into such extreme wealth as Quigley was to just not consider such a thing. Quigley was herself a Republican and believed in the Reagan platform, so was not unbiased in her work. I doubt anybody in her shoes really could be, saying to People magazine in 1988 that if Reagan had been a Democrat, I probably wouldn't have offered to help. In contrast to Quigley, there is a story by 11th century astrologer Guido Bonatti and a group of other astrologers working for Azzolino da Romano, the governor of Padua. Azzolino was famously a terrible person who everyone hated and feared. He kept the brother of one of his astrologers in prison, perhaps as leverage against that astrologer. One day he had this terrible dream and sought advice from his group of astrologers about what it meant. They took the chart for this and investigated it, and returned to Azzolino, not to worry, the dream was a false dream, and that he would, of course, be successful in battle. So Azzolino set off to go fight this battle on his astrologer's recommendations. He was then captured by the enemy and died in prison. So if you find yourself working for a bad boss, just get rid of them. To her credit, one area where I think Quigley tried to do this was in Reagan's dealings with Mikhail Gorbachev and Russia. Time and again in her book, Quigley talks about how her advice to Nancy regarding Gorbachev was that he was someone who was genuinely open to new ideas, that he was different from his predecessor, trying to do right by his people, and was honest or forthright about everything. She wanted to change Ronald's viewpoint of Russia into something more positive than the evil empire that he initially thought of it as. Famously, Reagan and Gorbachev would have a series of meetings during the Reykjavik summit regarding nuclear disarmament. When one of the terms was the cancellation of the Space Defense Initiative, Reagan shut it down, fearing that Gorbachev was trying to pull something over on him. Reagan gambled on the SDI, which ended up being a losing bet, as even today in 2022, we do not have the technology to sufficiently power this kind of laser defense system. Had Reagan put more faith in Quigley and Gorbachev both, we could be living in a world with much fewer nuclear weapons. This type of potential for political astrological consultants may see new life soon. As a group, millennials are more open to the utilization of astrology than previous generations. Eventually, unless the boomers figure out how to hold on to office from beyond the grave, these millennials will move to attain public office, and many will use astrology as a way to help them to do that. So to all of the astrologers out there, if you are ever called by a candidate running for office to help them through their career, I ask you to please consider how you can use astrology to guide that candidate, not just to victory, but also towards support of policies that genuinely help people instead of fueling their vanity or their ambitions. And if you are a candidate seeking to use astrology as part of your campaign, call me.